Hey guys, Argent here. So this is one of the most difficult subjects possible to talk about, and I'm obviously not going to list all the arguments for and answer all the arguments against, but I felt I owed Woody Strongback a better response, and I promised him that I would give him one. During the last episode of the Plebeian podcast, and if I remember, I'll put a link down there, he asked probably the most basic question of that people tend to have when they are questioning God or religion or the spiritual in general. They say, well, if there is some sort of higher power, how can the world be so filled with evil? And this is probably the hardest argument for a theist to deal with. And I regard it as the most likely argument, the most intellectually honest argument, and the one that would probably appeal to me the most personally, and it did historically. I mean, historically in terms of my own life. My issue is I think if we look at history or science or philosophy, I think the argument is much more in the favor of theism. But and I found at least the arguments for God are much more convincing than anything Dawkins or Dennett or the other guys have come up with. Um, for any number of reasons, as we'll go into a bit, the moral argument, the meaning argument, the design argument, the beauty argument. I did a whole series on that if you want to check that out, where I went through all the historical arguments. Um, I probably won't post a link to that. Just go to my YouTube page and the playlist, and I have a playlist with all of them in it. Anyways, so my point is, it's probably the best argument against God's existence. Although I don't know if it's really an argument against God's existence, because it could be that God is some sort of indifferent, distant figure who neither loves nor hates us, or it could be that God is some sort of evil, demonic figure, which is what the Gnostics believe. The Gnostics believe that God created the world because God is evil, and He created a world full of suffering for that purpose. Christianity tends to take a different view of it because we view that this world is good but fallen. That is, the things of this world are good. Matter is not inherently evil. Matter is flawed and corrupt, and the world is flawed and corrupt. But it's also created by God, so it's also good. So that being said, let's just jump into this. So the best person I've ever seen try to give a response to this, and keep in mind, just sorry, another side note. I'll get to it in a second. It's a very big topic. The Bible admits that this is a problem. There's a whole book in the Bible about this topic called the Book of Job. I would recommend it, and the book of Ecclesiastes are both philosophical discourses. More or less, the entire book of Job is a parable. Um, the tale of Job is about God allows a devil to test Job's faith by basically doing horrific things to him. He kills Job's family, he destroys his livestock, he besets him with boils, he basically tears him apart, and it's about Job trying to reconcile his faith and his moral rectitude in his life with the suffering that God puts him through. And kind of at the end, he can't take it anymore. He just goes like, God, why are you doing this to me? And God's response to kind of the suffering of evil is basically he says, to some extent, who are you to judge me? He's like, where are you when the bear cub cries for its mother? Where are you when the beggar starves to death in the streets? Where are you? Etc. He just basically explains how different the perspective is, and how different his rulership of the universe is. I kind of like to look at it as the example of a king. God is all powerful, but he cannot do the logically impossible, as we'll get into in a minute. And I think God ultimately, given what he created, has to face tough decisions. And some of those decisions are horrific, and they would destroy the sanity of a human being. But that's kind of the burdenship of leadership. Oftentimes, kings or rulers or whoever have to pick who to save, and someone lives and someone dies. And the Bible makes no mistake of this. God cast the plagues on Egypt because the greater good and the salvation of all of humanity depends upon the Jews going back to Israel. So that's to some extent. I know that's a bit of a duck, but I think it's a it does make some sense. Hopefully, if you think about it, and I did a video on this. Sorry if I keep referencing my videos. Called "Forever Between Heaven and Earth, or the Crown Rests Heavy," about this topic, about how kings have to mediate between morality and the dictates of this world, and how those two things are inherently always in conflict. So, C.S. Lewis. What can you say about C.S. Lewis? Probably the greatest Christian philosopher, other than maybe William Lane Craig of the modern era. His book it's done to death. Everybody always talks about Mere Christianity and The Case for Christianity. His other books. They fully deserve the reputation they get. He's an excellent writer, very clear, very straightforward, very witty. So, C.S. Lewis, and I've just pulled a bunch of compilations together for this. All of C.S. Lewis's works are in the public domain. I'll try to remember to include citations. If not, just ask me about them. So C.S. Lewis is talking about his past because he was an atheist who was actually converted by J.R. Tolkien. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got the idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such a violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because a man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet." Makes sense. If you're in the air, you panic. It's not the natural state. So basically, what he's saying here is, Woody Strongback, as a decent man, finds stuff like the horrors of the Holocaust or human suffering bad because he is a moral individual and he doesn't like human suffering. But it's why does he find it bad? There has to be some innate reason that he finds it bad. I guess we could go to evolutionary reasons, but I don't really want to get into biology with this. This is more kind of philosophical and moral. That's not because I can't argue it or I'm against looking it up or discussing it. It's just I can't cover everything in one video, especially for a topic this broad. So I'm just kind of lay out the argument, and hopefully it'll make sense that I can always do follow-ups. Let's see here. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, which is kind of like what Richard Dawkins and a lot of the new atheists do with regards to the liberalism that they hold so dear. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. So they're saying that God cannot exist because God is supposed to be good, and an all-knowing, all-perfect, all-loving God would not create a universe full of such evil, which presumes that that there is objective good and evil, which to most people at least would imply that God exists. So if there's no God, there's no good or evil, or if there is no good or evil, then you can't object to God on the basis that he's evil. Sorry, that's kind of a mental gymnastic, but just think about it for a bit, it'll make sense. Let's see here. Okay. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there was no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know that it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. Yes, so that's from C.S. Lewis's book Mere Christianity, and that is Rival Conception of God. So he's basically, I think that's pretty straightforward. He's just saying we would have the idea justice exists, and the idea that God can't exist because the universe is full of injustice, necessitates to some extent that God exists. It necessitates that an objective morality exists, that love exists, that compassion exists. So let's see here. So we have this. So that remains to be seen. Why is there so much suffering then? C.S. Lewis's argument, and this is an argument generally made by Orthodox theologians in particular, is suffering comes from free will. Suffering comes from the fact that God gave humans the ability to be free, and God created a universe. We'll get to this in a second. Essentially, it goes that God that free will is necessary to become like God. Part of what makes God so great is that He is a being. He's a being. He is a cause in and of itself, and any cause in and of itself must have a will, and must have to some extent a free will, an ability to think, to reason, to make decisions, etc. And that God cannot do the impossible. He cannot make a square circle. Logical impossibilities are not things that God can do. You can call that a limit on omnipotence, but it's really just it's just in reality, even supernatural reality, logically impossible. Creating a universe, I don't think is logically impossible. I think a square circle is logically impossible, or 1 and 1 making 5 is logically impossible. So, therefore, the argument goes, and we'll get to this now. Free will is probably the same in the universe. God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go either wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong. I cannot. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. It's a frequent statement in Christianity that faith and love are not a feeling, they are not a flush of emotions, they are an act of will. You decide on a fundamental level that you love something or someone, or that you believe in something. Things can necessitate you one way or the other, but ultimately the I am, produces it as an act of will. And I guess you can disagree with that, but this is just the argument. A world of automata, of creatures that work like... The happiness which God designs for His higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to Him, and to each other in an ecstasy of love and delight, compared to with which the most rapturous love between a man and woman on earth is mere milk and water. And for that they must be free. So why is this? I think the best metaphor is it's the difference between a child's love and an adult's love. A child just loves because he doesn't know better than to love. He just loves things. He has no discernment. He loves the good as well as the bad. His love is an ignorant love, one born of not understanding something. When he looks at his mother, he doesn't understand why he loves her. He has a very basic primal desire. He likes like a ball because of its shape, its color. It looks nice to him. But once you grow up, you're able to appreciate things on a higher level. You're able to explain why you appreciate them. You're able to feel complex emotions towards them. You have a much richer mental and emotional experience. And the idea here is free will is what allows you to develop from a childlike faith to an adult faith. And to some extent that is the purpose of suffering. Suffering provides grace. Suffering is a side effect of free will and of the way that God has set up the world. And we'll get into this a bit more later. Why doesn't God reduce the free... anyways. So, yeah. Of course God knew what would happen if they used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently, though, he believed it was worth the risk. He believed that creating sentient creatures in his own image, that is, thinking contingent beings, was so great and so beautiful that it was worth the sacrifice of having them experience suffering. Because a human life has well, not a human life, but a human soul has infinite value. It is eternal. It can think. one thinking being is of more use than half the planets in the universe, because its life is inherently valuable, life is inherently beautiful, life is inherently wonderful. He thought it was worth the risk. Perhaps we feel inclined to disagree with him, but there is a difficulty about disagreeing with God, for he is the source from which all your reasoning power comes. You could not be right and he wrong any more than a stream can rise higher than its own source. When you are arguing against him, you are arguing against the very power that makes you able to argue at all. It is like cutting off the branch you are sitting on. If God thinks the state of war in the universe is a price worth paying for free will, that is, for making a live world in which creatures can do real good or harm, and something of real importance and things of real importance can happen instead of a toy world which only moves when he pulls the strings, then we take it as worth paying. When we have understood about free will, we shall see how silly it is to ask, as someone once asked me, why did God make a creature of such rotten stuff that it went wrong? The better stuff a creature is made of, the cleverer and stronger and freer it is, then the better it will be if it goes right or wrong. Very true. Nuclear power is an example of this. Greatness is a coin all of its own, as I like to say. Probably the greatest achievement humanity has done is splitting the atom. We've created a weapon that can provide limitless power and has led to tons of breakthroughs in science that have improved people's lives in innumerable ways. But it also has the power to destroy cities. And man is like that. Man is both an angel and a demon. He is, as Nietzsche described him, tied between beast and overman, balancing on a tightrope above an abyss. Let's see here. A cow cannot be very good or very bad because it's just a cow. It just kind of sits there and eats grass. It doesn't really have ambition. It doesn't really have intentionality. It doesn't have a complex, emotional core. It can't build guns. It can't build weapons of mass destruction. But it also can't treat its own wounds if it gets hurt. A dog can be better and worse because dogs are more social beings. Dogs have a wider range of emotions and actions than a cow. A child, better and worse still. An ordinary man, still more so. A man of genius, still more so. A superhuman spirit, best or worst of all. How did the dark power go wrong? Here, no doubt, we ask a question to which human beings cannot give an answer with any certainty. A reasonable and traditional guess based on our own experience of going wrong can, however, be offered. The moment you have a self at all, there's a possibility of putting yourself first, wanting to be the center, wanting to be God, in fact. All agents here includes God himself. His omnipotence means the power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. There is no limit to his power. If you choose to say God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from it, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix them with God can. It remains true that all things are possible with God, but intrinsic possibilities are not entities. They are not possibilities. It is no more possible for God than for his weakest of his creatures to carry out two mutually exclusive alternatives. You cannot create a free creature and prevent it from exercising its free will. You can corrupt its free will, you can influence its free will, and Christianity argues that happens, that the devil and supernatural powers try to corrupt man, and that God and the angels try to raise man up. His power meets an obstacle, but because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about it in the context of God. Yes. So I think that's pretty straightforward. Free will is necessary, and free will must necessarily include things going wrong in order for it to happen. To some extent, C.S. Lewis views war, famine, plague, disease, and the horrific things humans do to one another as trying to put ourselves in the place of God and trying to decide what's best for the world. It's trying to say that no, the world that exists is not possible or should not be there, and we need to fill it with something else. So while other things obviously matter, and C.S. Lewis would not disagree with that, worshiping something else to the same level of God leads to suffering. So, we continue along. Besides being complicated, reality in my experience is usually odd. It is neither neat nor obvious, nor what one would expect. For instance, when you have grasped that the Earth and other planets all go round the Sun, you would naturally expect, all things being equal, that all the planets would be the same size and shape, all at equal distances from each other, say, or distances that regularly increased, or all the same size, or else getting bigger and smaller the further you go from the sun. In fact, you can find no rhyme or reason that we can see, no pattern in the stars. There is a certain extent because of gravity, but in this case he is correct. The planets don't seem to be in an obvious order. Um, some of them have one moon, one has four, one has two, some have none, and one has a ring. Reality, in fact, is normally something you could not have guessed. This is but one of the reasons I believe in Christianity. It is a religion you could not have guessed. If it offered us just the kind of universe we had always expected, that is an all good one, I should feel we are making it up. But in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone would have made up, because this problem exists. If this was being made a priori um, by someone, by like a philosopher, they would have built something in. They wouldn't have just left this question so difficult, which is maybe a good reason, maybe a bad reason. But I think in this case it's deliberate because the Bible even states, yeah, it's a complicated issue. It's an almost unanswerable question in the book of Job. It's something that they were always conscious of, and it's mentioned various times throughout the Bible. It's not as if this is something they were hiding. Human suffering is not something that's ever hidden in the Bible. If anything, the Bible really is all about human suffering, and that's the purpose of Jesus Christ, is liberation from suffering. It has that just queer twist about it that real things have. Which is true. People aren't exactly like books. They're similar, but not always. So let's leave behind all these boys' philosophies, these over-simple answers. The problem is not simple, and the answer is not going to be simple either. What is the problem? A universe that contains much that is obviously bad and apparently meaningless, but containing creatures such as ourselves who know that it is bad and meaningless. There are only two views that face all the facts. One is the Christian view that there's a good world gone wrong, but still retains the memory of what might have been. So I think all that is fairly straightforward. Sorry if it's kind of hard. I'm trying to just keep this as concise as possible because there's a lot of stuff to cover on this topic. I'm just trying to give you kind of a taste of C.S. Lewis's philosophy on this and just try to give you an introduction and just try to tell you some stuff about this. So, we're going to get to the final part of this, which is the argument, okay, so I buy free will, I buy that there has to be suffering, why does there have to be so much suffering? Why doesn't God always answer my prayers? Why doesn't God just do everything? So, another possible objection is this. Why is God landing in this enemy-occupied world in disguise and starting a sort of secret society to undermine the devil? Why is he not landing in force, invading it? To quote Christ, why does he not send 10 flights of angels? Is it that he is not strong enough? Well, Christians think he is going to land in force. We do not know when, but we can guess why he is delaying. He wants to give us the chance to join his side freely. Once again, we have free will. God doesn't want to force us to love him. He wants us to give us the chance to join him freely. He doesn't want to just force it upon us. And that's kind of the extent why miracles aren't always so obvious. Because it's very easy to believe if just like God just came down. Well, I guess Jesus just came down from the sky and like was glowing and stuff. And people were like, oh wow, that's God. That's kind of to some extent forcing it. And this is kind of one of the perennial issues that God faces. How much does he show? How little does he show? How much do you intervene? How little do you intervene? So C.S. Lewis goes on about this. I do not suppose you and I would have thought much of a Frenchman who waited till the Allies were marching into Germany and then announced he was joining our side. Exactly. It is far better to join the winning side before the war has been decided. But I wonder whether these people who ask God to interfere openly and directly in our world realize what it'll be like when He does. When this happens, it is the end of the world. Um, okay, let's see here. Because God is all just, and He must by His nature punish all of us. When He comes to bring justice, such a justice will come that no one will feel that they are not done by and are not treated in a fair fashion. That is what the promise of the last day is, and God just can't start judging people here and there, because once He comes to bring upon His judgment and to intervene directly, He will bring His full forces and He will end the world, and He will set all debts black and white to rights, so to speak. So that is essentially the explanation for that part of it. The world is under interdiction. It is under an ultimatum. God has delayed the execution and will not carry out the sentence to give us an attempt to confess and repent of our sins. When the author walks onto the stage, the play is over. God is going to invade, all right. But what is the good of saying you're on His side then, when you see the whole natural universe melting away like a dream, and something else, something it never entered your head to conceive, comes crashing in, something so beautiful to some of us and so terrible to others that none of us will have any choice left. For this time it will be God without disguise, something so overwhelming that it will strike either irresistible love or irresistible horror into every creature. It will be too late then to choose your side. There is no use saying you chose to lie down when it has become impossible to stand up. There will not be That will not be the time for choosing. It will be the time when we discover which side we have really chosen, whether we realized it before or not. Now today, this moment is our chance to choose the right side. God is holding back to give us that chance. It will not last forever. We must take it or leave it. So, this is Argent Templar. That was C.S. Lewis's attempt to explain the problem of evil and human suffering. There's a bunch of other stuff he wrote about it. That was kind of my impression of it. I can always do another video on this. I hope you enjoyed it. Signing out.